Okay, I'm just going to welcome to the stream Mr. John Kiriakou. And hi, John, can you hear me? There he is. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm so happy to see you. Thank you so much for being here with us.
My pleasure. Happy to do it.
Oh, it's absolutely fabulous. We've had so many people so excited that you're going to be here.
Oh, so, no, it's John, my pleasure.
John, we've just been doing a little bit of an intro over the last hour or so, just explaining to people who are going to be on the stream, but also what the understanding and founding purpose of this is for us, which is that we have brought together people from right across the political sphere with completely different political opinions and affiliations, because we are united in this one single purpose of advocating for the human rights, the protection and restoration of the human rights of Julian Assange, demanding his freedom, that he be allowed to realize his asylum in Ecuador, and also recognizing the threat to Julian and to WikiLeaks as a grave threat to press freedom. So I'd really like you to talk to us about those issues tonight, because you are a whistleblower and whistleblowers are dependent upon journalists to get their messages out. Is that correct?
Oh, it's absolutely correct. You know, especially in the intelligence community here in the United States, we're taught when we're first hired that if you see evidence of waste, fraud, abuse, or illegality, that you go through the chain of command. But time and time again, it's been proven that that just simply doesn't work. Tom Drake went through the chain of command. He was rewarded with 9 felony charges, including 7 counts of espionage. Bill Binney, Kirk Wiebe, Diane Rourke went through their chains of command, and they were arrested and harassed by the police. I didn't go through my chain of command because my chain of command created the CIA's torture program. I went to the press. And so really, for me, the only thing to do is to go to the press. Would-be whistleblowers email me, call me all the time. I get this all the time. And people ask me, who in the media should they go to? Well, outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Intercept have encryption keys on their websites. I don't trust any of them, frankly. And I tell people every time I'm asked, the only place to go is WikiLeaks, because WikiLeaks is the only organization that has never blown a source. It's the only organization you can trust to handle this kind of information. And that was true years ago with Chelsea Manning. It's true today.
Absolutely an amazing point.
Conversely, John, what is the threat? You know, if we fail to stand up for Julian, we fail to stand up for WikiLeaks. I mean, what is the wider impact of that?
Oh, the wider impact is that there's literally nowhere for a whistleblower to go. And so the information just doesn't get out. I can't tell you how many times people have said to me that they just assess that it's not worth going forward. So they just keep their mouths shut. And, you know, the country is lesser for it. Here in the United States, especially with national security whistleblowers, I believe very firmly that the American people own that information. The information belongs to the people, the citizens of the United States, not to the people who classified it. It's also illegal in the United States to classify something that is a crime. It's illegal to classify something so that it doesn't see the light of day, so that it can't go public. Well, that still happens every day. And the only reason we know about it is because of whistleblowers. Well, if there's no outlet for a whistleblower to go to, then the information never goes public. And then we don't know what our government is doing in our name. And we have a right. And to me, it's one of the most important rights that an American can have, the right to know what his government is doing in his name.
So I think we're getting a lot of feedback from people that they're finding it really powerful that we are recognizing that this isn't a left or a right issue, but this is a human rights issue, John.
Oh my goodness, yes. This is not at all an issue of left or right. This is specific to human rights, civil rights, and civil liberties. And it's not specific to the United States, certainly. This is an international issue. I think we're headed toward an international crisis if we turn our backs on Julian Assange. I know what it's like to feel like you're standing alone, to feel like the entire weight of the government has fallen on your head, that there's nowhere to turn, there's nowhere to go. I know exactly what the man is going through, and it's terrible. It's lonely. And so it's up to us to remind him and to remind the world, the broader audience out there, that we're with him, that we support him, we support the organization, and we support the issue, and that we won't back down. So many people here in the US have been cowed by these ridiculous comments by senior US government officials that WikiLeaks is akin to a hostile foreign intelligence service. Well, the reason that they've said that is because they're afraid of it, and they're afraid of the work that WikiLeaks has done. They're afraid because WikiLeaks has been effective. Let's compare WikiLeaks to the Intercept, for example. I'm biased against the Intercept because two of the journalists there were, I'll just say it straight out, they were responsible for putting me in prison for 2 years because they blew my identity to the government blatantly. They did the same thing to Reality Winner. They may have done the same thing to this FBI agent who came forward in Minneapolis, Minnesota. You can't trust a national security journalist if that national security journalist doesn't know how to protect his national security sources. But look at WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks has never blown a national security source, never. And beyond protecting the source's identity, they have protected the sources in the documents that they've released. And that's why this process takes time, because they're going through these documents to make sure that nobody gets in trouble, that nobody's identity is compromised. No journalism outlet does anything like that. That's specific to WikiLeaks.
That's such an important point. And and you have such a, with all that said, you have such a unique perspective on what is going on now on Julian's situation and the prosecution of him. So I was wondering what your perspective is right now on the current situation as it's developed, especially during the time between the first vigil and what we discussed then and now. Like, what do you see? Because you definitely have a very, very unique lens on this.
I try to stay current on these issues day to day. And I'll tell you the honest to goodness truth is I'm worried. And I'm worried for a couple of reasons. First of all, when Julian had his internet access suspended and his visitors suspended, I don't know why, but I believe this to be a temporary situation. I thought, okay, they're trying to make a point. A week later, they'll loosen things up again. And they haven't. Besides that, and this is what worries me even more, I delivered a letter to the Ecuadorian ambassador to the United States a few months ago, asking the ambassador to ask his government to let Julian have internet access. The very next day, an article appeared in the Wall Street Journal, and it was entitled, "Ecuador is Open for Business."
Yes.
And it talked about how the Ecuadorian government had approached the Trump administration to try to improve and to enhance business ties. That sent a chill up my spine because it made me think and fear that Julian may be used as a pawn so the Ecuadorian government can make a little bit of money. So that troubles me very deeply. And that's not something I was worried about just a few short months ago.
Definitely. It's an absolutely terrifying prospect that he might be used as leverage in that way, and that this suffering could be leverage. Really, really disturbing.
Let me interrupt you too. I want to talk about some rumors here in Washington.
Absolutely.
The rumor is that either Julian has been indicted in the Eastern District of Virginia, or that a grand jury has been impaneled in the Eastern District of Virginia. The reason why this would be done in the Eastern District rather than in Washington, D.C. or in any other district in the country is that the Eastern District of Virginia is known as the espionage court. No national security defendant has ever won a case there, ever. I was tried there. Ed Snowden was charged there. Jeffrey Sterling was charged there. We've all had our cases in the Eastern District of Virginia. There's one judge in particular, Judge Leonie Brinkema, who reserves all of these cases for herself. So she's been the judge for all of us, and we were all found guilty. Beyond that, she made it literally impossible to mount a defense, because every time we would motion the court to allow us to declassify information necessary to defend ourselves, she denied the motion. She denied 72 of my motions and approved 0. We were walking out of the courtroom one day, and I said to my attorney, "What just happened?" And my attorney said, "We just lost the case. That's what happened." Well, Julian is looking at the same kind of outcome. If he's forced out of that embassy and extradited to the United States, he cannot get a fair trial. It's impossible, because the deck is stacked, and everybody knows what's going to happen if he comes back to the Eastern District of Virginia. This is the same advice I gave Ed Snowden. Don't come home, because you can't get a fair trial here. Julian doesn't have the choice. And that's what frightens me even more.
Yeah, and that's so important to hear from you, from your perspective on that. I think that's a really important information for our audience to have about what it is exactly that he faces if he were to lose asylum or to walk out of the embassy. This would not be a fair judicial process whatsoever. So thank you for explaining that.
Oh, sure. And we also have to remember that the Brits are essentially puppets of the United States in cases like this. They will do anything that the U.S. intelligence community tells them to do. And I think we can all should assume that the U.S. has told the British that as soon as Julian walks out of that embassy, that the U.S. wants him.
Yeah, and I believe recently, after the first vigil, Cassandra actually tweeted an old leaked picture of the orders that the police guarding the embassy were given, which was to immediately arrest him, immediately put him into custody if he came out, even if he was somehow in, I believe the document said if he was in a diplomatic bag or something ridiculous like that. But basically, this is not a normal process that he's going through, and it would not be a normal result if he were to leave. So.
No, certainly not. And his hands are tied. Up until now, I think all of us believed that we could count on the Ecuadorians. I hope that we still can. I know that President Correa former President Correa has expressed disappointment in Lenin Moreno's policy toward Julian. I still hope that this policy is temporary.
I know we all do. Definitely. I hope so as well. I hope that with voices like yours and all of the other voices that are being raised, whether it's, Roger Waters, with his concert, and all of these efforts, I hope that will make a real difference for Moreno and his decision on this.
You too.
John, that point that you just brought up before about how the last time we got together for the first vigil event, you were confident, or you felt sure that Julian's communications would be restored. I think I felt exactly the same way. And the reason that we actually designed Unity for J as being a new mass movement and not just a continuation of #Reconnect Julian is because we actually thought to ourselves, oh yeah, he'll be reconnected any day now, but the larger issue is that we need to free him from the embassy. And exactly. we just took it for granted that because previously he'd been disconnected and then reconnected, that it was just a matter of time. But looking at, the geopolitical situation and seeing, as you're just talking about Ecuador and the developments with Lenin Moreno, it seems that we might have, I think it's a human tendency, actually. We look at someone like Julian who goes through so much, who faces such vast, incredible forces, and he seems to just, weather every storm and almost take it on the chin. But we know in reality it's not. In reality, he is suffering severely. He has serious medical conditions. His situation is far more dire than you would know by reading mainstream media. And I'm thinking like how dangerous it is that we would just take for granted that he'd be reconnected. And that seems like a huge danger to me.
Yeah, this is a lesson.
The urgency. We need to, there is an urgency.
That's right. This is a lesson that we shouldn't take anything for granted at this point. And you raised a very important point too. This is a human rights issue. relative to his health. And this is something that really is not reported anywhere. But the man's health cannot be very good. Closed up in that embassy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He needs sunlight. He needs exercise. He needs nutritious food. And we have no idea if he's getting any of that.
Well, fortunately, we do know that that they're feeding him. But there was probably the most alarming statement I've ever heard was out of one of his legal team a few weeks ago, who's actually said that, you know, he faces not even being able to see down the hallway because his eyesight is degrading so severely from only having this tiny limited space. That he's actually suffering organ damage. And I know from studying his medical reports that his doctors have said that he's at mortal risk. It's no joke. He is literally at mortal risk. So how do we convince people of this? How do we humanize him, John?
You know, I think we have to keep doing what we're doing, and we have to keep reminding everybody that this is a human rights issue. You know, the mainstream media tends to not cover Julian's story. There might be an update of a few sentences every once in a while saying Julian Assange is still in the Ecuadorian embassy. We need to make sure that it's out there all the time, even if that's just in the mainstream media for the time being. I have a small radio show in Washington, and we talk about Julian all the time. We interview people like Diani Burrito and Randy Credico, for example, people who know Julian and have seen him and have spoken to him, because we need that firsthand accounting of his health and his spirits and any news that he may have for us, anything that he has heard, perhaps from the Ecuadorians, perhaps from his attorneys. We need to make sure that the information is out there and people are reminded every day that this is a very important issue and it's very dangerous for Julian Assange.
Absolutely.
We did recently see a series of pieces come out of The Guardian. It was the typical smear pieces, but this time it was an entire series of them. And interestingly, they were based on anonymous sources, but those anonymous sources were leaking information about intelligence agency activities that had been actually in defense of Julian, providing security to the embassy. What's your take on that, John, where it seems that leaking information to the press is fine if you're doing it to attack a whistleblower rather than to be a whistleblower?
Oh, welcome to my life. You know, the biggest leakers in Washington are the White House, the CIA, and the FBI. That's been a fact of life since the creation of those organizations, because this is what they do. They do it to control the story. They do it to control the debate. They do it to influence public opinion. It's only a leak if it's something that they don't like. If it's something that they like, it's authorized. We see the same thing with The Guardian. And I have to add, too, I've been very disappointed in The Guardian. You know, The Guardian was one of the recipients of Julian's largesse, of information directly from WikiLeaks, and to turn on him like they have. And what's supposed to be a progressive paper is really very, very disappointing.
I completely agree. And that escalation of those 6, articles on him was really shocking to see. I mean, it really seemed like they were just piling on and accusing him of stuff that was absolutely ludicrous. And I thought it was great that we saw WikiLeaks actually, say that they were going to file a suit for libel because it was so ridiculous. So,
agreed.
And what do you think that signifies that we see those pile-ons like that? Do you think that that's because, you know, from their perspective, they had to, undo some of the successful backlash to this gagging of him, which has, as I said, it's become a backlash in terms of increasing support for him. Do you think that was the main goal with that, or was it more
I think that's part of it. That's part of it. We also have to remember that intelligence services all around the world are well schooled in psychological warfare.
True.
And I think that this is a concerted attempt, a formal attempt to weaken Julian mentally, emotionally, maybe even physically, and to to make him give up in the end. I think that's really the goal. You know, they can plant stories in whatever media they want. They put these false narratives out there, and people are gullible. They'll believe anything they read in the press, with the ultimate result being Julian's weakening.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
we can truly blame intelligence services for this and be right.
John, I'd like you to game theory a little bit for me. I think you can take this collaboration of intelligence services with the Guardian and smearing Julian Assange. You could take it two ways. One is that the US is now really on top of the situation, and they're like this far away from getting their hands on Julian, and they're winning the media war. That could be true. Or it could be, and this is what I suspect, that they are trying to depict that is the case, and that they are hoping that by depicting themselves as being in this position of incredible strength and Ecuador is collaborating with them, that they will be able to, you know, manifest the future that they want to realize, rather than that actually being the situation. What is your take on that? What do you suspect?
The second scenario is entirely plausible. And the reason why I believe that it could be the case, that you never hear any complaints really about WikiLeaks coming out of the White House. You remember during the campaign, Donald Trump said, "I love WikiLeaks." Remember that? I mean, he was grandstanding, of course.
Absolutely.
But
Definitely. I remember that.
Yeah. Well, so we're not seeing leaks coming from the Justice Department. We're not seeing leaks coming from the White House. The only things that we're seeing are coming from the FBI and the CIA. And then we're seeing actually public statements from former CIA Director Mike Pompeo. So there may be a policy split here, that this is a tier one target or operation for the CIA, but it's really not very important for the White House. So your second scenario may very well be the case. But again, either way, regardless of whether it's the first scenario or the second, one of the goals is to weaken Julian and to isolate Julian. And that's what we really have to push back on. And we really don't have much in the way of ammunition.
Except people power.
Exactly.
Because we know that international law is on Julian's side. We know that precedent is on Julian's side. He has won time and time again in his legal battles against the governments. I was going to say agencies, but really governments that are persecuting him and that are arbitrarily detaining him. I think what is going to have to happen is there's going to have to be a mass movement, an international movement, a la Free Nelson Mandela movement of the 80s, to push, to turn the tide, to put enough pressure on these governments that they will have to abide by international law and that they will have to free him. John, I'd like to take you back in time a little bit. I'd actually like you to take us back in time a little bit. From my perspective, you are a hero. You're a celebrated whistleblower. Your whistleblowing was of historic proportions. As I was saying earlier, when I was discussing the fact you'd be on stream, your revelations made a US president have to stand up and answer to what was being done. And there are very few people on this planet that can say that they've had that type of impact on global affairs.
He said,
but you just a moment ago, though, you were talking about feeling isolated and feeling like the world was against you. And so I wondered, can you take us back in time to explain to us, tell us the story of that transition? How did you get from point A of being all by yourself on your lonesome against the most fearsome intelligence agency in the world, arguably, to being a household name and celebrated as a hero and having your whistleblowing recognized at the level that it has been?
Well, on the day that the FBI told me that they were going to arrest me, they actually intended to arrest me that day. And the only thing that saved me was I said, I want to speak to my lawyer and I want to speak to him right now. That was on a Thursday. The FBI likes to arrest people on Thursdays because the courts don't arraign new prisoners on Fridays. And so you have to spend Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday night in jail. And frankly, they hope that you have a rough time. Maybe you get beaten up. It softens you up a little bit, and then you're more willing to take a deal. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that every whistleblower who's facing prison considers suicide. It's just a natural thing. I've spoken to 50 different whistleblowers, and to a man and woman, every one of them considered committing suicide in the very beginning. It's that terrible. It's that difficult. You really feel that isolated. But there were two things that kind of changed my perspective. One was my wife. She told me a couple of days after my arraignment on the following Monday, "They have consistently underestimated your strength. You can take them," she said. "You have to fight them." And she was right. I had to fight, and I decided that I would. She also said that I had to own my whistleblowing, that I had done nothing to be ashamed of. I had done something instead to be proud of. And that if I kept talking about it, eventually my side of the story would become the side of record. And the government's story would disappear after a while because they would move on to their next victim, who happened to be Ed Snowden. And so I did keep talking about it. Now, when I first went to prison, I was just, prisoner number 79683-083. I wasn't anybody. And then I wrote a letter, an open letter to my attorneys 6 weeks after I got to prison, just to tell them what the experience was like up to that point. I didn't even realize that I was blowing the whistle on corruption inside the prison, the prison guards' corruption. It led to an Inspector General investigation in the Department of Justice. And my attorney sent it to Arianna Huffington. She put it on the Huffington Post, and it got more than 1 million hits, which was a real surprise to me. I was getting interview requests from everywhere, from CNN and Fox and MSNBC and Time Magazine, the Washington Post, the New York Times. It was crazy. About 6 weeks after that, Ed Snowden went public with his revelations, and I wrote an open letter to him, and I followed it up with a private letter that I sent through a mutual friend. The open letter received many millions of hits. And I realized then, so it took me a good 6 months, I realized then that I wasn't alone, that there were a lot of like-minded people out there. I just didn't realize it. And so people started writing to me. And I made a decision on my very first day in prison that if somebody was going to take time out of their day to sit with a pen and paper and write me a letter, I was going to answer that letter. And I ended up answering more than 7,000 letters in the 23 months that I was in prison. And again, every letter that I received was a reminder that I was not alone, that we were in this together. And, we had a chance at success because this was a real movement.
That is absolutely incredible. And I think it's really, really helpful for the audience to hear that it made such a difference to receive those letters.
It did. It saved me.
I think that is really important for people to understand and apply the same to Julian in this situation right now.
I agree. Write those letters. It only takes a few minutes, just a few minutes. You can't imagine how much that'll brighten his day when he receives it and knows that he's not alone.
Absolutely. Because he's not just confined now to the embassy, as we know. He's obviously in actually a solitary confinement style situation. So
yeah, you know what? Let's spend a second on that, because that's exactly what this is. This is solitary confinement. The United Nations has declared solitary confinement as a form of torture.
Absolutely.
Solitary confinement. Just because he happens to have a television doesn't make it any less confining. So this is something that we need to remember. The solitary confinement, in part, is meant to break you mentally. And I don't care how tough you are or how strong you are, everybody is going to break eventually. So our letters are going to help keep him steady and sane and focused. It's up to us to make sure that he's not forgotten.
The human link there is so incredibly important. And it's interesting that Susie was mentioning that this has to be a movement for that's similar to the Nelson Mandela movement in the 80s. In fact, the UN's regulations and rules on solitary confinement are named for Nelson Mandela. They're called the Nelson Mandela rules. And I mean, we know that Assange is going into his 3rd month in this situation, and the limit beyond which it's considered torture is 15 days. So he has more than quadrupled that. And in addition, the medical records that Susie mentioned earlier also showed that he was already exhibiting effects of solitary confinement medically in 2015, years before this new isolation was implemented. So, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more about the whole issue of solitary confinement and the importance of the connection remaining there in some way.
Agreed. This is potentially grave. We all need to be worried about this.
I think that sometimes I think in American culture and in the public space, we think of torture and we think of something active and physical happening to somebody, that's this graphic and terrible. And that's true, but we underestimate how incredibly painful and how concretely isolation affects people physically and biologically. And just as you said, everyone will break at some point. That is so true. And that's backed up in medical literature. It shows that isolation absolutely causes brain changes. It causes all sorts of medical issues. So this situation, as you've said, cannot be underestimated.
At the CIA, they called it learned helplessness. And that's exactly what it is. You just accept the fact that you're helpless and there's nothing that you can do that's going to help you. You can't help yourself. And so you just fall apart. And I think that's what they're counting on.
Absolutely. And I think that, as you said, I think people sometimes hesitate to write letters because they think, oh, what can I say of importance? Or they think, well, will this even get through? And I think that if you have that type of hesitation, please just write it anyway. Even if they're all thrown out, if you are writing those letters, you are making an act that you are enacting, something that will really, truly help Julian survive this. As John's saying, we're his lifeline right now. So don't underestimate your own actions.
There were so many people who wrote to me just about their day, how their day was. One woman, visited her daughter. One woman wrote to me and explained this new card game that she had learned. A woman would take pictures of birds that landed in her backyard and send me the pictures. I can't tell you how wonderful that was. Because, for even just a few minutes, you forget that you're in a cage and that you're being held under armed guard and surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers. It's liberating, even just for a few minutes. So don't worry about trying to think up something profound. Just say hello and tell them how your day is.
That's incredible to hear. I think that's really important for people to hear, because I know that a lot of people, as Susie was saying earlier, they don't see Assange as a human being like the rest of us. They see him as somebody who's kind of up on a pedestal almost. Yeah. And we really have to understand that he is a human being and he needs connection to other human beings in order to survive, because we all do. So
that's right.
Definitely. So I'm going to check chat really fast and see if we have any questions for you that are in that chat. One moment while I look. If you guys have questions for John, please let us know, and we will pass those on immediately.
John, I'm really interested to know how you yourself, because you're also in that same kind of position where you are lauded as a hero by so many people. They look up to you so much for what you've done, but at the end of the day, you know that you are yourself. You're a normal guy. You've got a family. You've got a normal life. You deal with the every day-to-day struggles of every person on the planet. Have you felt that disconnect between the way that you are depicted, the image of you, versus your reality?
Oh, yeah, most definitely. I'm just a guy. I'm just a normal guy. There's nothing special about me in any way. And I'm subject to the same kind of pressures that everybody else has, maybe more, because with my conviction, for example, I lost my federal pension. And so I'm going to have to work until the day I die. That's just a reality. Daniel Ellsberg told me one time that one thing that all whistleblowers have in common is that they die broke, that they're never able to make a financial comeback after their whistleblowing. I'm determined that won't be me. But, as the years begin to tick by since I first went public, I'm realizing that may be me. So yeah, I don't see myself as anything special. Frankly, I tried to not blow the whistle. I kept waiting for someone else to come forward and nobody did. So I finally said something.
Wow. You know who said that word for word?
Huh.
Snowden. That's very true. It's very, very, very true.
Yeah. And the cost is very, very high. You know, it's not just financial, but personal too. My wife finally had enough, and she walked. And I can't blame her. The stress is terrible. The pressure is unbearable sometimes. So yeah, there's
But
a
what's
high
the
price.
counterbalance to that? Like on one side we have the price, the risks that we take, the price that we pay, the horrific price that we pay. But on the other side of that, as Snowden says, you can look yourself in the mirror
I
and
say that
and
every day.
you
I'll tell
can
you
sleep at
something.
night.
4 days before I left for prison, Jose Rodriguez, the godfather of the CIA's torture program, the deputy director of the CIA, tweeted at me. And he said, don't drop the soap, asshole. And I gave myself an hour to cool off. And then I tweeted back at him and I said, Jose, I'm on the right side of history and you are not. And I left it at that. And I know all these years later that I was right. I was right and he was wrong. And I know I can sleep at night. So it was worth it.
That is so important to recognize. And it's really horrific how those types of people that are so high up in the intelligence community will take these really like personal and ad hominem attacks at not just yourself and not just whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning, but also, of course, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. It really reveals their true nature, I think, when we see those attacks.
It really does. There are a lot of sociopaths walking around. Yeah.
Definitely.
I think that it's interesting because I was just contemplating this today, actually, about a certain CIA, ex-CIA, now state official who I won't mention, but I was actually contemplating this very factor, which is that in their day-to-day life, they have all of the cushy perks of having sold their soul to the devil. They have the nice suits, they have the big pay packets, they have the safety of knowing that they're not going to be stalked and spied on and targeted and smeared. But when they go home at night and they have to look themselves in the mirror, on some level, I believe that they are conscious that their power is derived from this apparatus that oppresses and that destroys our planet. It's not, they don't have any personal power. The only power they have in their life comes from has been given to them or granted from them selling out to the system. They're selling their souls to the system. Whereas whistleblowers and some journalists are the opposite of that. In their day-to-day lives, they don't have the power other than that they can derive from their own speech and their own self-worth. They don't have the trappings of power. They don't, they have to face the smears and the hardships and, as you say, like the financial ruin. But then at nighttime, they can look themselves in the mirror and they know that they didn't sell out to the system. They are not participating in the destruction of the planet. And I was very much contemplating that today because we think of these people as these big scary figures, these CIA, top CIA officials and whatnot. But it's the system that holds the power. It's not those people as individuals. If anything, those people as individuals have sold out their ability to have any personal power to become an agent Smith of the state. Am I on something? You're laughing, John,
Yes,
so I must be on something.
You're really on to something that's quite true. A former senior CIA official told me just last week, he's been retired for, I don't know, a year and a half. He told me that he had to go on an antidepressant medication because on Friday, he was one of the most important people in America. And on Monday, he was a nobody because he had retired and he can't handle being a nobody. And so he's been struggling with such profound depression that he has to be medicated.
Wow.
And that's a theme at the CIA. They all think that they're the most important people in America because they have sort of self-appointed jurisdiction over life and death for so many people. And then they trick themselves into thinking that they're irreplaceable. And in fact, they're very replaceable.
Absolutely. Yeah, the groupthink that goes on in the intelligence agencies that can be so intense. I've read, in different press reports that it's so intense that it actually damages their ability to function in some instances. Is that something that you have seen or want to reflect on?
Absolutely. In fact, one of my attorneys, Bruce Fine, and I have been talking about writing a book exactly about that. Because if you look at it, at the major international developments over the last 70 years since the creation of the CIA has been wrong about just about every one of them. And it's because of that groupthink. They throw around these slogans and business buzzwords about thinking outside the box and establishing a red team or a tiger team, and it's all nonsense. They don't know what they're doing. In fact, they end up sitting around a conference room table and just agreeing with one another.
That's incredible. That's amazing to hear. Like, it's from somebody who's really experienced it. That's really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Just back to the psych issues thing. It just reminds me of the WikiLeaks, and I'm sure that this has got to be one of the reasons the CIA really has it in for them. WikiLeaks publishing the leaked Brennan emails from his mail.com address. Yes. And in there was, sure enough, was his psych reports from he'd actually been seeing a psychologist to deal with the emotional fallout of being a tyrannical CIA director.
It's so funny, isn't it? A CIA psychiatrist once told me that the CIA, and I say this in my speeches all the time, the CIA actively seeks to hire people who have sociopathic tendencies. They try not to hire sociopaths because sociopaths have no conscience. And with no conscience, they easily pass a polygraph exam, but they're impossible to control because they don't feel guilt. People who have sociopathic tendencies do have a conscience and do feel guilt, but are happy to work in moral, ethical, and legal gray areas. The problem is that because sociopaths are sociopaths, they're going to slip through the cracks anyway. And like in any corporate environment, it's the sociopaths who work their way to the top. And they work their way to the top because they're also happy to just climb over the backs of their colleagues and coworkers to make it to the top. And that's how you end up with a John Brennan or a Jose Rodriguez or a George Tenet, because they actually are sociopaths.
But yeah, that makes so much sense. Go ahead, Susie.
But then even these sociopaths that are involved in so much, inflicting so much pain on this entire planet as well as people on it, they still seem to have at some level this deep psychological fallout. And I find that quite fascinating because that tells me that even though they're conditioned to exhibiting this psychopathic behavior, at some level, I truly think that deep down in a little box somewhere that they keep it hidden in is this tiny scrap of conscience.
Well, I personally disagree with that completely, but that's just my personal take on that. I think there are people that are biologically different than other people in that way, but I'll step out of that and let John.
I hope Susie's right. I don't know, to tell you the truth, but it seems to me that any normal person, I mean, you can only kill so many people or be responsible for the deaths of so many people before something gets to you. I mean, you've got to end up with PTSD or some kind of psychological malady. You can't just, unless you're a true sociopath. And then you can just kill with impunity and go right to sleep at night. I don't know.
So this is just bringing this back to Julian. This discussion is making me reflect on the fact that the CIA derives its power from its ability to inflict violence and to control people. And Julian Assange has derived his power from his ability to save people, for his ability to provide them with the truth. The CIA derives power from lies, from their false flags and their fake color revolutions and their everything else. Julian and WikiLeaks have derived power from truth-telling.
And that's why they're such a threat, because if there's one thing that the CIA cannot abide, that is transparency.
Their
That
entire
makes so much
house.
sense.
That's the house of cards, right?
Exactly.
It can bring down the house of cards. Amazing. That also reminds me, while we're getting into like theory of stuff, it reminds me of a diagram that I saw. It was a counterinsurgency doctrine. And it said it's like the three pillars of society, and one was the financial, one was the police, and one was the government. And these three pillars are in a house formation. And on the bottom, the foundation of the house is information. And information was the only factor that had the capacity to bring down all three pillars. And they said that each pillar on its own could fall and the structure could remain. So you could have a total financial crash, but the police state, the security state and military, and the government combined would keep the house up. You could have, lose your military force, but still the financial and the government is enough to like rebuild that, as we've seen in many states that have had to rebuild their security forces. We could have lose the prime minister has to sit down, the government is dissolved, but you still have the police and military security state, and you still have the financial role that the house stays up. But the information pool at the bottom, when you threaten that information pool, you place all three pillars in jeopardy. And that was the counterinsurgency doctrine.
Oh, I believe every word of that. I think that's exactly right. And years of thought have gone into that doctrine. They know exactly what they're talking about.
But again, we have this like yin yang where the CIA would use that doctrine to destabilize a country. They would use information warfare to destabilize those three pillars that are holding that society together. WikiLeaks is using information to destabilize those who would destabilize the society, if that makes sense to you. It's like they are almost like the inoculating force. WikiLeaks is like the inoculating force to the virus.
Absolutely right. And that's why we need WikiLeaks, because there are no journalistic outlets that have that kind of power. Only WikiLeaks does. The Washington Post isn't going to take down the CIA or the New York Times or the Guardian or the Intercept. Only WikiLeaks has that kind of authority and leverage. That's why we need a strong WikiLeaks, and that's why we need a free Julian Assange.
Exactly. They have the integrity that nobody else has. Nobody at all. So from your perspective, how do people, what are some of the ways, and I know we've hashed this up before, but from your unique perspective, how can people that are listening and watching, actively help support WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, in addition to the letter writing to keep him, connected to humanity? What are some of the things people can really tangibly do to help that you think of from what you've been through?
I was speaking to a member of Congress about a week ago, and the topic of WikiLeaks came up. And this guy's a very conservative Republican. He's a member of the Tea Party caucus here in the States, which is it's a group of the most conservative members of the House of Representatives. And he said that he had sort of a knee-jerk reaction against WikiLeaks for a long time, until constituents began to write to him and to ask him to support WikiLeaks. And so he said he never really gave it much thought until people began to write. And, these guys really are responsive to their constituents. They really are. I've worked on both the House side and the Senate side, and I can tell you that when people write letters to their elected representatives, they listen. And so he actually reevaluated and reassessed his entire position on WikiLeaks. I'm not sure that he's willing to say that publicly yet, but one at a time, and over time, we can actually win this thing.
I think that's a really, really valuable piece of information for people to have, because I know that when I give that answer to people, well, you can write letters to your representatives, you can write letters to so-and-so, there's kind of that sense of like, well, that's not enough. And people have to understand how much of a real impact that makes.
It's a big deal, truly.
Absolutely. So is there anything else you want to talk to us about your experience with Julian Assange or WikiLeaks or anything else related to this whole issue?
I just want people to understand that.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go right ahead.
No, my audio just cut out for a second and I thought it was hers and then I realized it was mine. I'm sorry, go for it.
Sorry.
I just wanted to say that I'm genuinely worried about Julian. You know, before they cut off his communication, his access to the outside world, I wasn't really worried about him. And I thought, well, you know, eventually this thing is going to play out and he's going to end up being fine and something's going to happen. They're going to drop the charges and they're not going to charge him in the first place, or the Brits are going to walk away or whatever. I'm worried now. I'm worried because I really believed for a long time that we could count on the Ecuadorians. And I'm not sure that's the case anymore. So I feel like there's a sense of urgency or immediacy, and we need to pull together and be active now more than we ever have in the past.
I completely agree. I think it's so important to hear that, to hear and understand that message. Definitely.
John, from your perspective, what was the most significant? I mean, WikiLeaks has got dozens of significant publications, but what was there anything that for you was deeply personally significant?
Yeah. You know, in the Snowden revelations, the notion that the American government was spying on its own citizens, I think most people don't understand the full significance of that information. The NSA and CIA are forbidden by law from spying on Americans. NSA's charter actually prohibits it from spying on Americans. But that's exactly what they were doing. Using 9/11 as an excuse, using the Patriot Act as a justification. It was only because of Snowden's revelations that A, the American people became aware of what was happening, and B, members of Congress began realizing that this thing is starting to spin out of control. And so it's just now in the last year and a half that Congress has begun to reject certain provisions of the Patriot Act. They've just begun to weaken parts of it. So we can't call it a victory yet, but we're headed in that direction. And that's only because of Ed Snowden and WikiLeaks.
I find it fascinating what you were just saying, that members of Congress actually are responsive, because I remember when Courage Foundation was urging supporters of Laurie Love to reach out to members of the UK Parliament. And I actually thought to myself quite cynically, you know, nothing against the effort, but I thought to myself, oh, will any of these politicians even care? You know, what's the chance of them like reading the letters? And then sure enough, Courage was able to drum up like some phenomenal amount of MPs, wasn't it like 60 or 70 MPs, some huge amount of politicians, and actually managed to get them to advocate for Laurie. And I think it very much was a deciding factor in that case, in the successful outcome of Laurie's case.
You know, a dozen House members and 2 senators wrote to the Bureau of Prisons inquiring about my well-being and threatening them to not put me in what was called diesel therapy, which was to transfer me to different prisons around the country to silence me. And it was only because people were writing letters to their congressmen. These congressmen really are receptive. They really are reactive to it.
That's amazing.
Yeah, go ahead. Well,
how do we leverage that? How do we leverage that for Julian?
You know, there's something to be said for a good old-fashioned letter writing campaign. They're important, especially if you're writing to people who actually represent you. For example, I live in Virginia. If I write to a senator from South Dakota, he's not going to care, or a congressman from South Dakota. But if somebody from South Dakota writes, they're going to jump to attention. And I can write to my representatives here in Virginia, and they will jump to attention. So if we've got a concerted nationwide or semi-nationwide campaign going, we can really get results that way.
You know, we've just had a question from the YouTube live chat, and they've said, why did Obama believe his legacy would be enhanced by his commutation of Chelsea's sentence? And that is I can't even say the word. It synchronizes with the thought that I was just having, which is remembering that WikiLeaks, you're just talking about the power of a good old-fashioned letter writing campaign, that WikiLeaks actually did letter writing campaigns to Obama on Chelsea Manning's behalf years before the eventual commutation. So what would be your response to that question about why do you think that Obama did go ahead and commute the sentence?
I actually know the answer from inside Obama's head. And I'll tell you why. A very wealthy Greek-American businessman who is very personally close to Joe Biden approached Biden to ask him if he would ask Obama to pardon me. And so I went to Delaware one night. I took the train and went to Biden's house. And this Greek-American took the train down from New York, and we met at Biden's house. And Biden agreed to go to the president the next night and lobby for me. So the next day, the two of them went to the White House. I went home. I wasn't invited to the White House. And when they came out, the Greek-American businessman called me and he said, "You would have been so proud of Joe Biden. He went to the mat for you. He argued your case with everything that he had." And then he said, 10 minutes into it, the president put up his hands and said, "Guys, I'm just not going to do this. It's either him or it's Manning." And Manning got 35 years. And that's why Obama did it. Obama was not upset that Chelsea was convicted. Obama just believed that 35 was too much. So he didn't really commute Chelsea's sentence out of the goodness of his heart or because of some pursuit of justice. I mean, we all know now that Barack Obama was the enemy of transparency. He waged a war on whistleblowers. Chelsea just got lucky in the end.
Yeah, that's something that a lot of people underestimate and don't take into account is how much Obama actually escalated a lot of these problems. And
Don't forget that Obama prosecuted 8 national security whistleblowers. That's almost 3 times the number of all previous presidents combined.
Extremely just mind-boggling that a supposedly liberal president would do that type of thing. And it really kind of reveals that it's not just, it's not neocons on one side of the political spectrum. This is obviously an unelected power structure that persists despite whoever is elected president. And that's the power that, as you've been saying, Julian Assange is up against right now. And that is what is so disturbing. And I think, as you mentioned, that's what overrides the fact, whatever comments Trump may have made on the campaign trail, that unelected power structure has its own agenda. So,
yeah, let me leave you with one thought. I know my time is up. It's 9:59.
Oh, you're fine.
Let me leave you with one more thought. There's a pardon process, a formal pardon process here in the States. It's both pardon and commutation. In Barack Obama's final 2 years as president, the U.S. pardon attorney recommended 0 people for a pardon. 0. There were lots of commutations, but nobody was pardoned in the last 2 years. So, you're right. It doesn't matter if you're liberal or conservative or neoliberal or neoconservative. It makes no difference. We have to elect people, regardless of party, for whom civil rights and civil liberties and human rights are important. Because the deep state or the federal bureaucracy, whatever you want to call it, isn't going to do it for us.
That's an incredibly important, statement, and it's a great one to leave everyone with. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Best of luck tonight.
Thank you. It's an honor to speak with you and have you here.
The pleasure's all mine. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
John, we are so lucky to have you. I just want to thank you too from the bottom of my heart. It's really special to get to speak with you. Your contribution is amazing. Thank you so much.
And strength to Julian. I'll talk to you soon.
Julian, absolutely. Thank you.
Definitely.
Good night.